Happy New Year, inside joke. Hey, Steve Lowry, the editor of The High Low. Welcome to this live chat with Cal State Long Beach professors Jeffrey Lawler and Sean Smith. Jeff and Sean study video games. That's what they do. And I don't know if you know, but that's kind of popular these days. They have actually started a center called the Center for History of Video Games and Critical Play. Fellas, thank you for being here. We're going to talk about all different kinds of things related to video games, what they say about us, what they say about the people who play them. But we first would love it if you could just kind of describe to us what the center does and what its mission is.
So we started the center about 5 years ago with a small donation from a private donor, which is now funded through donations and other small grants. And what we do is we collect by consoles, games, ephemera, and we have what we call a playable archive. So the archive has consoles going back to the 1970s, through the 80s, 90s, current consoles, games, books, research material, where our students and the community can come and play, do research. It's also connected to courses that Sean and I teach. We teach a class, a digital methods class. We teach a class about understanding representation in games called Playing the Past. And we just developed a new course called The History of Computing and Gaming Technology, which will start fall 2021 at Cal State Long Beach. So we look at the history of video games, the culture surrounding it, the way games kind of are imbued with a cultural moment. And we also look at how games use history and express history. And we also use games to teach too. There's sort of a pedagogical method to using games to get across historical methods and process.
Speaking of that, we've spoken with a lot of teachers and professors about presently how you have to teach via Zoom and things like that. And a lot of the teachers have just told us it's exhausting. There's no momentum in the class. There's no any easy kind of back and forth. Is it possible that something like teaching through gaming could kind of not only get kickstarted, but really pushed along as people now are much more open to maybe some alternative forms of learning?
I would say that the simple answer to that is probably yes, and that it is. I mean, I'm in the process of teaching one of my lower division classes right now, and we've integrated a video game engine into the way that they're approaching their final projects for this class. So we're using an engine called Twine, which is essentially a interactive fiction engine that creates a kind of choose your own adventure style game or interactive fiction element. And instead of writing a final paper, kind of a traditional midterm or final, they're engaged in creating plausible historical situations, characters that each of them will then in turn get to play each other's final paper, essentially. And so they're doing kind of the traditional research skills of a historian, asking historical questions, doing primary source analysis, reading secondary sources, and crafting these situations in which their character, and I was talking to some students this morning just before we got on, and one of them commented and said, "I'm learning more in this and doing this than I would have ever thought I could learn in doing a final paper for you." Wow. And it's because she's so invested in the characters that they're creating, and in some ways they want to make certain that the situations they're putting their character in is reflective of the true history of that they're studying. So I've been pleasantly surprised at how it's working for us, especially in this kind of Zoom environment where traditionally I'd be in the classroom and be able to look over their shoulder and really kind of integrate or interact with them. And here they're taking it on their own. Several of them are taking it on their own to really to engage in the material, to engage in the assignments, and I think find pleasure in it in some ways where they would typically not find pleasure in doing the work that we often ask them to do.
Sean, Jeff, how did you two find each other? How did this come together?
we have a
Hinge,
long
I don't know.
history, but we have a long history in a weird way, not a weird way, in a just like we grew up in the same community. We never really hung out, but long story short is Sean and I had done many things together out of sort of the academic world. And then again, about 6, 7 years ago, we had been talking about using video games in the classroom as a way to have students think about history. But we also really noticed that students were playing video games that had a lot of history imbued in them. You know, classically Assassin's Creed really kind of made a lot of that happen. Call of Duty is a huge franchise, one of the biggest. And we talked a lot about students' experiences with that. They're bringing that to the classroom. And many of our students, the very informal surveys were becoming history majors after playing historical video games.
Wow.
And so we really started to think about, well, we can introduce these, then we can talk about how history is being used and how it's being represented. And then we just decided, you know what, before we got the grant, let's start collecting material and let's start getting this in the classroom and talking to students and see what they think about it. Then we got the small donation or grant, and it's built upon that. And our relationship in terms of collecting the material and connecting with students, we really built kind of a community of students who play games, talk about games. Last night, Sean and I, during the regular semester, we have gaming nights where students come in, we play mostly board games or tabletop games, but we have the consoles for students to play. And it's usually every Tuesday or Thursday night. And we get like 12, 15 plus students every time in the rotating students. And we try to keep it up this semester. And I was talking to Sean earlier, we do it via Zoom now. So last night we were playing games with students and they're all historically based. And that way we can also on the side, reference what we know and how history is being used. So that's a long arc to where we got, but Sean and I have always communicated. Our offices are across the hall from each other. Now that we have the Playable Archive, we're both usually in there, archiving, writing, talking to students. Yeah, it's the student, we have the space. It's for us to develop, but we really use it as a space for students to come to relax, to talk about games, to talk about research, and to be a kind of space that's comfortable for them. So we use the space in many ways. It's for research, but it's also for the community of students in general in the history department.
For people who might be students or any kind of viewer who's looking in right now, I would just like to remind you, because I always forget to, that this is your show too. Please, if you have comments or certainly questions for Jeff or Sean, go ahead and ask us on Facebook and we'll be sure to ask them. I want to ask you to, when you started the center you said about 5, 6, 7 years ago, when you proposed the center, was there pushback? Was there like, oh, come on, kind of a thing?
Yeah, there is. Right. It's not, it wasn't from some of the more kind of, I guess, what we call progressive or younger scholars and faculty. People have been looking at video games, especially in terms of kind of American culture, world culture, isn't anything new. And American Studies has been doing it for quite a bit of time. It is new for historians to look at these things. Historians are typically a little slower to adopt new technologies and to think about where various forms of pop culture fit into our understanding of the past. So when we introduced this idea of using video games, both pedagogically and scholarly,
you're a historian, not a linguist. It's
exactly.
Okay.
We ran into several issues. The first big issue hurdle we ran into was when we started to create our class, the history and historical memory class. several of our colleagues on the proposal for that class kind of pushed back and asked why anybody would want to look at video games, what value was there in video games. And so we had to spend some time kind of defending our choice. I mean, and to be honest, this is what in 2018 it was a $138 billion industry.
Yeah.
It's tracking for $155 billion this year because of COVID and more people spending time at home playing, it being introduced and playing these games. And like Jeff said, our students come to our class because of the games they've played, whether that's the games they were playing in elementary school, like Mex, Oregon Trail or Carmen San Diego or whatever it is. There's, I think, a good association, often a kind of warm, fuzzy association with the history that is a part of these video games.
Yeah.
And if we can leverage that and get students interested in the liberal arts through their interest in what are traditionally STEM avenues, then I'm all for it. And so our argument has been one of kind of reviving or rethinking the way that the liberal arts approaches its competition with STEM, and rather
we don't see it as a competition, right? We want to work interdisciplinarily, which is very difficult. Sorry to jump in,
Yep,
Sean,
that's fine.
But in some of our classes, what I'm teaching now, the Playing the Past, which looks at representation in history, I get CS students, I get English students, I get students who are like English, they're interested in narrative. They're going to be writing a game, right? The CS students, they're going to be coding part of a game, right? The history students come because it's a history of video games. So that's what they're interested in. So we're reaching more students, and we'd also like to reach more colleges and disciplines, because the field itself is ripe for interdisciplinary connections.
Let's talk about history. You mentioned two very popular games my son loves to play, Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed. And there are other ones. There's Dead Red. We had an actress who was on that a few months ago. These are entertainments that are based in history, but one of the driving forces is a use of force and a use of violence to move the story ahead. Is that simply a business decision because companies say, well, that works for the movies? Does it say something about us as humans or as Americans? Have you looked at that? Like why these games, why violence is, I would say, necessary, and most people would just be blasé about it. I said, of course they have to be shooting games because that's how all these games are.
That's a big question.
That's a big question that
I'm going to start on a tangent that gets to it, though. And I'm going to start with Assassin's Creed. Which one was the French Revolution? Not Unity. Unity. And so that falls in the wake of many Assassin's Creed games. There's violence. You're an assassin. Yeah. So and Ubisoft, they consult, or they have an on-site historian, but they also consult other historians. And that was a big deal when that came out, particularly in France, because of its representation of the French Revolution. And we have several colleagues who teach French history, and one that it was just over, who looks at that period extensively, Richard Flamine. And the historian that they consulted for that, this is double-edged sword. Like, use a historian to kind of make it historical, but they often, in this case, like picked a historian that fit the structure of their narrative of a violent, bloody revolution. Now, it was a revolution. There was blood, but his sort of thesis about the game was one of extreme violence towards a very specific group, and that exactly fit with how they could tell the narrative or the history of the French Revolution. Right. So, other genres like Red Dead Redemption, fall into the mythic tropes of the American West, and this idea of pervasive violence, which is, again, falls into legendary quality, right? That's my entry into do they need violence? Right. There's a lot of games that don't. Mm-hmm.
Sean? No, but I think what the reason that they're focused in this way, and and this comes to something that Jeff and I are trying to maybe combat a little bit in our classes and in doing this kind of work. These are the way that they approach these games, whether it's Red Dead or Call of Duty, tend to play to popular notions or heritage-based understanding of American or Western history, right? And so the West has always been in popular culture a place of violence where the gun is the equalizer and where everybody and through that violence comes a kind of democratic notion of a level playing field, right? Good with a gun, everybody's all right, fine. The Call of Duty series plays to a kind of American military centric exceptionalist narrative of the macho masculine hero who really kind of unquestioningly mows down essentially an anonymous enemy who's been reduced to these caricatures, right? And so these exceptionalist narratives or these myths, these are the games that our students are playing. This is the way that Americans are and the broader public are consuming games, and there's nothing we're going to do to change that, right? Those AAA games are popular and make money because that's the story that their players and their market want to play. And it's going to cause outrage, and we've seen uproar anytime a shift in the way that those first-person shooters are managed, right? So if you're playing Modern Warfare and you're allowed to play with a female character, there's going to be an explosion of well actuallys, right, that she wouldn't have fit, and obviously all of a sudden accuracy matters in the history that is being portrayed when the history itself is already inaccurate as all get out, right? So and I don't think there's going to be a way to really change that, but what we can do, and I think what we're trying to do with the way that we approach this, is that we want to give our students the tools to critically examine that kind of history, right? To take those games and to ask the questions that you're asking. Why violence? What does it mean? How is this reflective of the way that Western cultures are portrayed, or the way that masculinity is working, right? So these commercial games offer us a really good jumping off point. And we can then, in our classroom, the other thing that we can do is we can introduce people to small games. We can introduce people to independent developers who are doing games that are much more interesting, that don't have the violence, that don't have the narrative rooted in imperial conquest or colonialism, right?
Sean,
like the Civ games.
Stick with that. So we all know about the big things. They're basically like the Star Wars and Raise the Lost. These are the big franchises we all know about. It sounds like what you're describing with these smaller ones are almost like art house kind of things. What kind of games do you find right now the most compelling, the most interesting?
So
I'm gonna let Jeff take that.
Okay. Well, that another big question. So, well, Sean and I were talking last night, and like, there's a game I had forgotten about that it came out recently, and it's by an independent developer. When we say independent, it doesn't necessarily mean how you might imagine art house. A lot of these developers are coming from other big developers and branching off and doing their own things. We were talking about a game last night today, When Rivers Were Trails, which is a game about Native American experiences. And a lot of the people involved in creating the game, consultants in the game, were Native Americans locally here in Southern California. There's another game called Never Alone that's about the Inuit, and it was developed by the Inuit, and they got a grant. And it's about their sort of experiences blended with sort of their creation stories. There's smaller games. What's the one that just came out about Nazi Germany? Really good game.
the one about the Poland, about Poland.
About Poland.
And then
I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of this game, but it deals, it's done really well. I wouldn't call it a small game, but it's a game that deals really closely with the history and brings up these questions of how people would have acted or interacted in these changing environments during sort of fascism in Eastern Germany and Poland in the war period. And there's lots of other games. There's a game called 1979, A Revolution, that's about the Iranian Revolution, where you go in as a photographer. This is developed by Iranians, right?
That sounds great.
And these games are good. Like, these are really well developed. Gone Home by Jonathan Norhagen is a really clever game where you experience what it's like you figure out as you're exploring a house that you are you're an individual whose sexual orientation is different than you expected, and you kind of learn about this by searching the house. So there's a lot of different ways that games do explore this, and I would argue too that, you know, some of the bigger games, AAA studios, they do, I think, listen to some critique. You do see a bit more or better representation of non-traditional characters. It might not be on point, but I think over the course of the last 10 years, as people in game studies and history have kind of brought these issues up, that they've started to ask questions about those things.
Right.
Guys, we have a question from Andrew Alonso. He actually asks three. I'm going to take the middle one. Andrew, thanks for asking. He said there's a plethora of man versus alien games now where you go against aliens. I'm curious about that. We saw those kinds of movies in the 50s, and even though they're silly, they spoke to an anxiety and a fear of nuclear annihilation, basically.
Right,
we see it in Japanese. Is the same thing going on with video games?
I think we would argue it absolutely. In fact, my current project is thinking about the way that Cold War anxieties are actually being partly represented in the way that games were created in the 70s and 80s, right? But also in the themes of some of those games. Jeff and I have been doing a YouTube series, strangely enough, on looking at early NES games, Nintendo Entertainment System, the original Nintendo console games, whose themes aren't overtly war, but represent the kind of Cold War anxieties of America in the 80s. So we've been looking at, there's a game called Ultimate Dodgeball, where it is a kind of violent dodgeball game where America has to take on various countries around the world, and your ultimate enemy is the Soviet Union. It's the USSR team, right? Okay. And so it's a vicarious Cold War moment done in a kind of entertaining fashion that allowed players in the 80s, I think, to feel better about our position vis-a-vis the world, right? And in control in some ways, right, in their living rooms and places like that. And like film before, as you mentioned, right, The Blob is about the Soviet takeover, right? It's a red menace that's creeping across the Midwest. And games do the same kinds of things. So depending on when those games are being developed, right, we can read them in a critical fashion. And this is one of the arguments that we've been having with our fellow colleagues in game studies. A lot of the historians who are looking at games now really want to look at games that are just history. Right. So let's look at Call of Duty. Let's look at Assassin's Creed. Let's talk about the representations there. And our argument in a lot of the work that we're doing is that all games are imbued with some historical kind of meaning, right? And that these alien games that are being put out, right? I'm this is taking this into the contemporary, and I'm a historian. I'm not real comfortable commenting on contemporary culture, but you can read a kind of anti-immigrant text into an alien invasion into an alien invasion game if you want, right? And that these are going to become the primary sources in 20, 30 years for the next group of historians who look at games to unpack and to talk about, right?
Speaking about history, I'm ripping you guys up. In one of your papers I was reading, you mentioned how movies for years have presented historical movies that are in fact not factual, that they have some facts and some facts not so much. If you were to watch the movie Amadeus and you think, oh, I know all about Mozart, that's really not Mozart's story. Salieri, if anything, was his friend. So that's not true. I'm just curious, in the ones you've studied historically, what is the biggest whopper that one of these big video games have shown that you find a lot of your students maybe actually believe now because they see it in the video game?
Oh, that is a tough question.
I don't think you can. Well,
I
ahead,
would go
Jeff.
back. Well, I would go back just as it was mentioned before, just because it's so endemic, is any of the sort of Western games, whether it's Call of Juarez or whether it's the Red Dead series or Six Guns Over 12, like these, the quote I use is from a historian Meyer, who says it's history of the West is a fiction built on a fiction built on a fiction built on a fiction, right? It's dime novel to early film to just over time.
Yes.
And so we're so used to these things. And Sean is a history of the American West too, and I teach a class on it. And the students, like when they play those games, like that feels like it to them. That feels like the West that they know through TV and film and everything that they expect. And I play some of these things in my class for them. And, you know, then we do the history of the American West, and then they come away with, wow, that's different. But I will say this, you know, when we do study games and the history within games, accuracy is one thing, right? And it like films, we don't have a tendency films can be accurate, but that's not their end goal, right? They're doing something else. Their medium is something else. And so our expectations, our historian, is not necessarily that they're authentic in the way that an academic paper would be, you know, peer reviewed or something, but that the way they do represent people and ideas comes across in a realm that telescopes accuracy in a more meaningful way, right? That each moment doesn't have to be pure, but it should have representational forms, whether it's the people or the events that are situated appropriately. We are not going to argue tooth and nail over a little detail being wrong, because that's neither here nor there, particularly for us. And a lot of people who play games, you know, they kind of fetishize over the authenticity of like the weapons and the guns and whether, you know, all the things are correct in the uniforms. And
but the fetishism and accuracy is also often put to ill use in some ways, as a tool of denial. Right.
As a tool to authenticate the presentation of the history, like this is right, so the rest must be right.
Or we're running out of time, and I want to ask this one question, and it's way too big, and I apologize. We might go a few minutes over. Everything in our culture nowadays gets politicized. Sports gets politicized. Cartoons everything gets politicized. And we're coming out of an election cycle, kind of. Maybe it's never going to end. I don't know. But anyways, video games, since when we see statues go down and things like that, you clearly see a schism between how people see history. And it is vastly different, and they have vastly different reactions to it. Are we seeing the same thing in reactions to how video games portray history, where we have people say, I'm not going to play that game because I don't buy that narrative?
In fact, that's kind of where I was going with that idea of accuracy as deniability. Okay. Right. That is that in a lot of these games, Civil War games are probably one of the easiest to point to. In almost every Civil War game, slavery is non-existent, and enslaved populations don't play a role in the narrative at all. What happens is war sim and first-person shooter or third-person shooter kind of mechanics, where you can play out Confederate fantasy if you'd like, and where there is no there's no ramification for taking on the side of the traitor in the Civil War, right?
Mhm.
And you can you can fight that war again and have the right side win. And if somebody is to, right, and it's in those areas where that authenticity or accuracy, right, and it comes down to the weapon and the uniform, and nobody, and you defend the existence of the game based on the accuracy of the Confederate uniform, and you deny the historical narrative that's being perpetrated by allowing a player to take on the Confederate side, essentially defending slavery,
It's the
in
lost cause
playing that
argument
game. Yeah,
played
it's
over and over. Yeah.
yeah, and so you just get this kind of lost cause Southern revivalist Southern kind of argument that comes out of these games, and nobody's asking for those to be removed,
Mhm.
right? You'll have a side that'll stand up and say, right, we should get rid of them for these various reasons, and that's when, no, they're accurate. Look, it's just a Civil War sim. It's fine, right? And so, yeah, that's I guess that's kind of, it's maybe an interesting place to end on, right? Is that these games are representative of our culture,
Yeah.
and all of the inherent issues that arise in any cultural form, popular cultural form, are going to be imbued in the study of these games. And for us, right, rather than thinking about the contemporary issues, we're looking at how representations of the past work, or where, for me, the bulk of my work in the last 5 years has been trying to understand the toxic masculinity in contemporary games. Where is its beginning point, right? And
All
I
right,
keep
see, and that's
reaching further and further back to, right, to me, the Cold War engineer is now kind of becoming the place where I'm interested in looking at, are these games engineered from the beginning with notions of masculinity and other things of that nature? So for us, it just kind of creeps and keeps going backwards, right?
Sean, that's a great place to end, because, and it's also a great place to jump forward, because I got to have you guys on again. This is the fast.
Sure.
I can't believe this clock is accurate, that this is already done. This was fascinating. And we didn't even get into toxic masculinity, which I would
No.
love to talk to you about. I heard you guys mention that you have a YouTube channel. Where
Yeah.
can people find that?
Oh, I don't know what our channel is, to be
Oh,
You know
honest.
what? We do
You
have
Professor, a PR guys.
Twitter,
Yeah.
and a Instagram handle.
Yeah,
That's
Should
probably
they
Critical
use your
Play
names or
org.
the center?
We use the
This-
centers. So
the center is easier.
the easiest place to find us is on the web at criticalplay.org.
Criticalplay.org. Okay.
And that will
Everything's
take you,
attached there.
that will take you to all of our other
the
social
other.
media and our YouTube channel and everything else that are, including our writing that we share
Oh,
publicly.
cool.
So,
And that I steal from. So it's awesome.
fair enough.
It's an
not all on
homage,
there.
actually. It's an homage.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeffrey, Sean, thank you so much for being here again. We're going to have you on again, because this is
Cool.
this is too good. But
Thank you for
thanks
having
again. And
us.
thank you to everybody at home who asked a question, especially you, Andrew and Aaron. Sorry we couldn't get to you. But thanks again for being here. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.